am a futurologist. Well, you're very polite, Royal Institution. How can anybody have such a ridiculous job title as futurologist? How can you have an ology, a logic, a science about the future? Isn't that a contradiction in terms, an oxymoron? A bit like military intelligence. Or Brexit means Brexit. Or as a very sad man said to me in a bar the other night, married life. But the reason I use such a ridiculous term as futurologist to describe what I do, and what I do is I study the trends of the present, trying to understand how they might develop, and most importantly for this meeting, how they may intersect and how they may influence each other. And I do that in order to try and see possible scenarios of the future. But the reason I use that silly word, futurologist, is that it allows me to make a point about one of the problems we have in thinking about the future. And that is that just as we don't have a good word for somebody who studies the future through studying trends, so I suggest we have no language for the future itself. Specifically, we have no language for tomorrow's technology. And where there is no language, I argue, there can be no complex thought. And that makes it very difficult to consider new concepts when they first arrive and to communicate with each other across the silos of specialisms. It's always been this way. For example, I would imagine that the projector, when it was first invented, would have been demonstrated on this spot. But because we didn't have language for the device, we called it a magic lantern. We could only describe that device as a lantern with magic properties. When the automobile was invented, we called it a horseless carriage. We could only describe it as a carriage without horses. The locomotive, the railway engine, was an iron horse. Aeroplanes were flying machines, refrigerators were ice boxes, radio was wireless. So it takes a bit of time after a technology arrives for us to develop a vocabulary with which to discuss it, with which to think about it. And as more and more technology arrives at ever faster speed, so the problem becomes more acute and more intense. After those inventions I mentioned a few moments ago, in the 20th century after wireless, we actually had things like television, we had computers, we had the internet networks, and today, at the forefront of it all in information technology is the smartphone. Well, I want to suggest to you that the smartphone, the term smartphone, is as useful to understanding where that is going as the phrase horseless carriage was to consider the future of the automobile in 1901. Now today I want to talk about the 6 key drivers of the future that will shape the world in which energy and transport will play such a role. Philip has already alluded to the first of these key drivers, and it's actually a very important issue. It is world population explosion. 7.5 billion people today. Recent research suggests 8.2 by 2030, above 9 billion by 2050, and then still climbing, maybe as high as 10 or even 11 billion people. How are we going to find the food, the energy, the water for an extra 3 or 4 billion people? Well, it turns out that out of all of those things I've mentioned, the most difficult is water. And we won't be having giant water tankers crisscrossing the world's oceans as oil tankers do today. I'm sure the solution will be low-cost, local desalination. But it has to be low-energy desalination and renewable energy desalination. So the first major trend, which is unstoppable, is world population growth. The second key trend shaping the rest of this century is, of course, climate change. I don't suppose there will be many skeptics in this room today about climate change, because we're already seeing the symptoms of more extreme weather. And I'm afraid we have got to plan all of our development, all of our technologies, and all of our strategies to ameliorate the worst effects of climate change, and we've got to try and prevent it climbing too high. The third key driver of the future comes out of the first two, and that is energy transition. Now, I've been doing this job of mine for 35 years, and I have been talking about what I called the energy crisis until about 2 or 3 years ago. And I was saying that what we have to do is migrate from fossil fuels to renewable fuels. And I saw that it was going to be a long and difficult path. In the last couple of years, I have been severely, absolutely uplifted by the fact that the price of renewable energy has fallen so rapidly, and the price of generating it is falling so rapidly. As you will know in this room, in the last 5 years, the cost of solar panels has fallen by about 80%. And the efficiency has risen only by about 10%. But that's a tremendous, tremendous event. And we are now seeing the uptake and the generation of renewable, sustainable energy at a faster rate than I thought we would 5 years ago. And I'd like to think this trend will continue. And it still means that we have got another 30 years, 40 years, still using some fossil fuel components. But this is a transition that we have to make. It is one that is all important. The fourth key driver of the future is globalization. Now, the current trend in Britain and in the United States is a little bit more towards isolationism. But globalization is a trend that has not stopped. The activities of China, the activities of Southeast Asia, the activities of Latin America are all showing us that globalization is vigorous and still growing. There will be squabbles, there will be back and forth things in trade, but globalization is a trend that's irreversible. The world is trading together, and it's using the arbitrage of labour costs in one territory and real estate costs in another territory to actually create growth. And I'm a person who believes that most of globalization has been a good thing, because over 1 billion people have been lifted out of absolute poverty since modern globalization began in 1995 or thereabouts. The fifth key driver of the future are the multiple revolutions in medical science. Healthcare and medicine will be transformed in the next 30 years. DNA-based medicine will allow personalised medicine for each of us. At the moment, medicine is one size fits all. Stem cell medicine will allow us in 20 years to replace our body parts with tissue that will not be rejected by our bodies. We will have backup organs. Gene-based therapy will allow us to fix 40 genes. And the outcome of all this is that for somebody today who is perhaps 40 years of age, on average, they'll be likely to live now not to be 90 or 95, but to be 110. That doesn't mean that you or I will enjoy this advantage, but this is on average. Medicine is undergoing multiple revolutions. But I come now to the sixth key driver of the future, and it's the one really that brings us all here today. It is accelerating exponential technology development. And sometimes when I'm speaking at a posh university, I will use that phrase, and afterwards an elderly English professor, a languages professor, will say, "You know, Ray, you don't really need to say accelerating exponential technology development. You realise that's tautologous. It kind of means the same thing." And I say, "Well, thank you, sir. But actually what I mean is that the exponential rate of technology development is itself accelerating." And we feel the effects of this every day in our ordinary lives. And what it means for practical purposes is that in the next 25 years, we'll have 100 years worth of development at today's speed. There is so much coming. Now, we could talk about artificial intelligence. And as you know, the papers are full of headlines about artificial intelligence and robots becoming our masters. Well, frankly, that's nonsense. If you really want to know how intelligent artificial intelligence is today by human standards, it's about the level of a rodent. And of course, artificial intelligence will get much more clever rapidly because of accelerating exponential technology development, but it's nowhere near any form of general intelligence that humans understand, nor will it be in the next few decades. But we're here today to talk about transport. And what's clear to me is that we have to relate the theoretical world with the practical world, with the everyday world. For example, driverless cars are a reality. And actually, they're already safer than human drivers. The problem we've got in the practical world is that the infrastructure and the legislation isn't yet made available in a way that can be used in widespread terms by driverless vehicles. Within the next 10 years, we will see driverless vehicles on the roads of this country, for example, at airport campuses, at university campuses, at selected and small city centre areas. But because our infrastructure in this country is pre-industrial, pre-automobile, the practicalities of allowing driverless cars wide range on our roads, frankly, is not going to happen for 20 years, maybe 25 years. The difficulties are immense. What we will see is a great deal more assisted driving, driving which is aided by thinking machines. We'll see highway automated driving, and we'll see more and more safety features, which I welcome greatly. We certainly will see the move towards electric vehicles. And I've heard a lot of debates about what the future of propulsion is. Is it hydrogen? Is it electric? I argue that it's already won that race. Electricity has done it simply because electricity infrastructure is here. And there is no hydrogen infrastructure at all. So it is clear to me that the future is electric, provided the electricity is generated from sustainable, renewable sources. Electric cars are not much greener if you charge them from fossil fuel electricity. Certainly we'll see some electric planes, but actually long-distance jet travel is going to remain reliant on high-density energy from fossil fuels for some decades to come. There is no doubt about that. But above all, transport will be joined up. everything travelling will be talking to everything else travelling. And what this actually means is more intelligence, greater safety, and more economy. It means more environmentally friendly transport. And just as everything travelling will be talking to each other, so we need every industry sector to be talking to each other for cross-innovation. And the problem that we have when dealing with new technology is that we don't have the language. I spoke earlier of the smartphone, and I said that I thought the smartphone was a terrible name for this device, like horseless carriage for a vehicle. But I'm going to tell you now where I think it's going. I am going to pretend that I'm a visitor from the year 2035. I have come here today with my faithful assistant, and she is called Maria, and she lives just behind my left ear. Maria is connected to my invisible body network, and Maria talks all the time to the global brain. You know what that is, don't you? We used to call it Google. Maria, and I've named it after my own wife, Maria, because I speak to this Maria so often that if I were to speak in my sleep and say, Maria, my wife wouldn't think I was having any sort of relationship other than their own. Maria is what the smartphone has become. We have no language for the future, but even although I lack the words and I lack the vocabulary to try and describe the future, thank you for listening to me this afternoon. Thank you very much.